Nia's stomach tightened, not out of fear, but exhaustion. She knew how these things could go. Signaling carefully, she eased her car onto the shoulder, put it in park, and took a slow breath, keeping both hands visible on the wheel. Years in the military had taught her the drill. A white patrol car pulled up behind her, and the officer took his time stepping out. When he did, he moved with the swagger of someone expecting compliance. Boots scuffing the asphalt, one hand on his belt, the other flicking on a flashlight. Nia glanced at his badge through the side mirror. Reynolds. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat, impatient, no greeting. She met his eyes in the mirror, then reached slowly for the glove compartment. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone steady. Reynolds didn't answer, just took her documents, holding them out of reach as he scanned her car. "Tail lights out," he finally said. Nia frowned. "That can't be right." His eyes narrowed. "You arguing with me?" A tense silence hung between them, the air thick with unspoken power dynamics. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of Reynolds' challenge. Nia Carter felt the familiar prickle of tension, the kind she'd encountered in high-stakes moments, on naval bases, in debriefings after covert operations, or during late-night training drills in hostile territories. This wasn't a war zone, but the power imbalance was just as real. She kept her gaze steady, her voice calm but unyielding. "I'm not arguing, officer. I'm stating a fact. My tail lights were inspected 2 weeks ago at a certified shop. If there's an issue, I'll have it checked again." Reynolds tilted his head, his smirk curling like smoke. "Step out of the car," he said, cutting her off as if her words were irrelevant. Nia's pulse quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. She glanced at the empty highway stretching ahead. No other cars, no witnesses. The night air carried a faint chill, the kind that seeped into your bones if you stood still too long. Her fingers tapped once against the steering wheel, a habit from years of keeping her cool under pressure. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, testing the boundaries of his authority. Reynolds leaned closer, his flashlight beam darting across her face, invasive and deliberate. "Because I said so," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. She let his words hang in the air, weighing her options. Compliance might de-escalate, but it could also embolden him. Pushing back risked escalation, but Nia wasn't one to shrink from a challenge. She'd faced down superiors who underestimated her, colleagues who questioned her place in the Navy, and enemies who thought her resolve would break. This was just another test. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she pushed the door open and stepped onto the pavement. Her movements deliberate, her posture relaxed but alert. The gravel crunched under her boots, grounding her in the moment. Reynolds took a step back, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, sizing her up like a predator assessing prey. Nia stood at ease, her hands loose at her sides, but her military training kept every muscle ready. She could feel him calculating. How far could he push this? "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered, his voice sharper now, the smirk gone. Nia raised an eyebrow, just enough to signal she wasn't intimidated. "For what reason?" she asked, her words measured, each one a quiet assertion of her rights. Reynolds' jaw twitched, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Are you resisting?" he snapped, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his radio. Nia held her ground, her eyes locked on his. "No, I'm asking a question," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of someone who knew the law and wasn't afraid to wield it. She could see the gears turning in his head. Anger, maybe a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't used to this, to someone who didn't flinch or back down. Without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered, his tone performative, like he was already scripting the report. Then louder, to her, "Turn around now." Nia's heart beat steady, her breathing even. She knew this moment was pivotal. Her training had drilled into her the importance of staying calm, of thinking 3 steps ahead. She could comply and fight this in court, or she could push back and risk becoming a statistic. But Nia Carter didn't survive years of service by letting bullies dictate her fate. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I need you to understand something. I know my rights. I know what you can and cannot do. If you're arresting me, I'd like to know the charge." Reynolds froze for a split second, caught off guard by her precision. Then his face hardened. "You're under arrest," he barked, reaching for her wrist. Nia stepped back smoothly, just out of his grasp, her movement fluid, practiced. "Under arrest for what?" she pressed, her tone unwavering. "For obstructing an officer," he growled, pulling out his cuffs with a metallic clink. Nia exhaled sharply through her nose, a flicker of anger breaking through her calm. So that was his play. Fabricate a charge, assert control, and expect her to crumble. But Nia wasn't just anyone. She was a decorated officer, a woman who'd navigated systems rigged against her and come out stronger. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car, the cold metal grounding her resolve. Reynolds didn't hesitate, yanking her arms behind her back and snapping the cuffs on tight. Too tight, deliberately so. The metal bit into her wrists, a petty act of dominance. He shoved her toward his patrol car, his grip rougher than necessary. "You don't know what you're doing," Nia said softly, almost to herself, as he opened the back door. Reynolds chuckled, pushing her inside. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing," he said, slamming the door shut. The hard plastic seat pressed against her back, the cuffs digging deeper into her skin. Outside, Reynolds strutted back to his vehicle, muttering into his radio, his silhouette framed by the flashing lights. Nia sat still, her breath measured, her mind racing. She'd been through worse. Combat simulations, interrogations, missions where one wrong move meant disaster. This was different, though. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. But he'd miscalculated. Nia Carter wasn't just a driver he could intimidate. She was a force he hadn't reckoned with, and soon he'd learn exactly what that meant. The patrol car's door slammed shut, sealing Nia Carter in the dim claustrophobic space. The faint hum of the engine vibrated through the hard plastic seat, and the cuffs bit into her wrists, a constant reminder of Reynolds' petty cruelty. She shifted slightly, testing the restraints, too tight just as she'd expected. Her reflection flickered in the partition's scratched surface, her face calm, eyes sharp. Beneath the composure, a fire simmered. Not rage, but resolve. She'd faced power-hungry men before, in boardrooms and battlefields, and she knew their weakness, overconfidence. Reynolds thought he'd won, but he was already unraveling his own game. Outside, Reynolds slid into the driver's seat, whistling a tuneless melody, his movements casual, almost performative. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching Nia's gaze for a split second before looking away. "Well, well," he muttered, buckling his seatbelt with a smug flourish. "Let's take a little ride." The car lurched forward, red and blue lights painting the highway in rhythmic flashes. Nia watched the road slip by, the empty stretch of asphalt a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She stayed silent, letting him fill the void with his arrogance. "You know," Reynolds said after a moment, his voice laced with mock curiosity, "most people just do what they're told. Step out, keep quiet, no fuss." He glanced at her through the partition, his smirk back in full force. "But you had to make this hard." Nia exhaled softly, her breath barely audible. She could hear the bait in his words, the invitation to argue, to give him more ammunition. Instead, she leaned back, her posture relaxed despite the cuffs. "Most officers," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "don't arrest someone for asking a question." Reynolds let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head as if she'd told a bad joke. "Lady, you must think you're somebody special," he said, his knuckles flexing around the steering wheel. Nia's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, just enough to unsettle him. "I don't think," she replied, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "I know." The words landed like a quiet grenade, and for a moment, Reynolds' bravado faltered. His grip on the wheel tightened, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug exterior. He recovered quickly, though, masking it with a scoff. "Military, right?" he said, his tone shifting to something almost conversational, as if he could charm his way back into control. "I can spot that attitude a mile away. That above-the-law vibe." He chuckled, glancing at her again. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you flashed that confidence." Nia didn't respond. letting his words dissolve into the hum of the engine. She'd learned long ago that silence could be a weapon, forcing men like Reynolds to confront their own insecurities. He clicked his tongue, feigning pity. Shame. If you just played nice, we could have skipped all this. Her jaw tightened, not at his taunt, but at the audacity of his logic, that his abuse of power was somehow her fault for not submitting. She thought of the countless others who'd sat in this same seat, without her training, her resources, or her resolve. The weight of that reality settled over her, fueling her determination. Reynolds didn't know it yet, but he'd picked the wrong fight. The station came into view, a squat gray building looming against the night sky, its parking lot nearly empty. Reynolds pulled into a reserved spot, killed the engine, and turned to face her through the partition. Gotta say, he murmured, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction, I do love when they make it easy. Nia held his gaze unflinching, her silence louder than any retort. He smirked, stepping out and slamming his door with a flourish. A moment later, her door swung open, and he gestured for her to move. Let's go, he ordered, his tone clipped. Nia stepped out, the cuffs still biting into her skin, but she kept her head high, her stride measured. As he led her inside, past a desk sergeant who barely glanced up, she felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person Reynolds had bullied, every life he'd disrupted with his unchecked power. The holding area reeked of stale coffee and sweat, a metal bench bolted to the far wall, a steel door leading to the cells beyond. Reynolds uncuffed her just long enough to process her, fingerprints, mugshot, the routine humiliation of booking. The officers around them moved mechanically, their indifference a stark reminder of how men like Reynolds thrived in systems that looked the other way. When it was done, he grabbed her wrist again, his grip unnecessarily tight, and led her toward the cells. Think you're smart, huh? He muttered, his voice low, meant for her alone. Nia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. I don't have to think, she said, echoing her earlier words, knowing they'd burrow under his skin. Reynolds' smirk twisted into something darker. Enjoy your stay, he sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Nia caught herself before she stumbled, turning to face him as the metal bars slid shut. He tapped the bars lightly with his fingers, a final taunt, before walking away. The lock clicked into place, and the sound echoed in the quiet. Nia sank onto the bench, the cold metal pressing through her jeans, grounding her. She took a slow breath, her mind already mapping the next steps. One night, that's all this would be, because Reynolds had no idea who he'd just crossed, and soon he'd face the consequences of his own arrogance. The cell was stark, its four concrete walls closing in under the flicker of a single overhead light. The faint smell of disinfectant mingled with the lingering odor of sweat, a reminder of the countless others who'd sat here before. Nia Carter settled onto the metal bench, rolling her shoulders to ease the ache from the cuffs. Her wrists still burned, the skin raw where Reynolds had tightened them, but she pushed the discomfort aside. She'd endured worse, grueling night marches, high-stakes missions, and the relentless scrutiny of being a black woman in a Navy uniform. This was just another challenge, and Nia was built for challenges. Through the bars, she could hear the low hum of activity at the front desk, officers murmuring, the clatter of keyboards, the occasional ring of a phone. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Control the breath, control the mind, she thought, a mantra from her early days in basic training. Her heartbeat slowed, her focus sharpening. Reynolds thought he'd cowed her, locked her away where she couldn't fight back, but he'd misread her silence, mistaking it for defeat when it was strategy. Nia wasn't just waiting, she was planning. Heavy footsteps broke her reverie, their rhythm unmistakable. Reynolds. She didn't need to open her eyes to know it was him. His stride carried the same swagger she'd clocked the moment he approached her car. He stopped in front of the cell, arms crossed, his silhouette looming against the bars. Comfortable? He asked, his voice thick with mockery. Nia opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a calm that unsettled him. She didn't answer, letting the silence stretch until he shifted his weight, a subtle sign of discomfort. You know, he continued, stepping closer to the bars, if you just played along, you wouldn't be sitting here. His smirk returned, but it was less confident now, like a mask he was struggling to keep in place. All that attitude and for what? Nobody's coming for you tonight, lady. Nia tilted her head slightly, a slow, deliberate smile curling her lips. I'm exactly where I need to be, she said, her voice low, each word laced with quiet certainty. Reynolds's smirk faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He covered it with a scoff, glancing around the empty holding area as if to reassure himself of his control. No one's bailing you out, he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a taunt. People like you always think you're above the rules. A little confidence, a little lip, and you expect to walk away. He chuckled, but it sounded forced, hollow. Nia let him talk, let him dig his own grave. His words didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. She sat back, her posture relaxed, her eyes never leaving his. The power he thought he held was already slipping, and she could sense it, even if he couldn't. Then a new sound. Lighter footsteps, hurried, approaching from the hallway. A younger officer appeared, probably in his late 20s, his standard-issue uniform crisp, but his expression uneasy. He clutched a clipboard, his knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. Reynolds, he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. Reynolds barely glanced at him, still focused on Nia. What? He snapped, irritation creeping into his tone. The younger officer shifted on his feet, glancing toward Nia's cell before lowering his voice. We got a call. You need to see this. Reynolds frowned, his eyes narrowing as he finally turned to the officer. See what? He asked, his voice sharp. The younger man hesitated, then leaned in, speaking in a hushed tone. Nia couldn't catch every word, but fragments reached her. Lawyer, higher-ups, questions about the arrest. Reynolds' posture stiffened, his jaw clenching as the officer stammered through an explanation. Whatever was said, it wasn't good news for him. He shot Nia a glance, his confidence cracking like thin ice, then stepped away, following the officer down the hall. Nia leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her mind racing. She'd made a call before leaving home that evening, a precaution born of experience. A friend in the Navy's legal division, someone with connections that stretched far beyond this small Alabama precinct. She hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly, but she wasn't surprised. Men like Reynolds thrived on intimidation, but they crumbled when the spotlight turned on them. The hushed voices grew more heated, Reynolds' tone sharp and defensive, the younger officer struggling to keep up. Nia allowed herself a small, private smile. The tide was turning. Minutes later, the heavy footsteps returned, faster this time, almost stomping. Reynolds stormed back into view, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The smirk was gone, replaced by a scowl that betrayed his unraveling control. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his voice low but shaking with anger. Nia met his gaze unflinching, her expression serene. "I didn't do anything," she said, her tone almost gentle, like she was explaining something obvious. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." Reynolds' face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. For the first time, Nia saw it. The dawning realization that he wasn't in charge anymore. The power he'd wielded so carelessly was slipping through his fingers, and he had no one to blame but himself. He turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. Nia exhaled, settling back against the bench. The cell was still cold, the cuffs still tight, but none of that mattered. The game had changed, and Reynolds was about to learn just how badly he'd misjudged her. Morning light filtered through the courthouse's narrow windows, casting sharp streaks across the polished wooden floors. The air was crisp, carrying the sterile chill of institutional spaces, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter if you lingered too long. Nia Carter stood near the defendant's table, her navy blazer tailored to precision, her blouse simple but crisp. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, just an unshakable presence that filled the room without effort. Her attorney, Erica Vaughn, stood beside her, flipping through a stack of documents with the efficiency of someone who lived for moments like this. Vaughn's movements were deliberate, her focus absolute, and Nia appreciated the quiet competence. They were a team, and today they were here to finish what Reynolds had started. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Reynolds walked in. He still carried himself with a veneer of authority, shoulders squared, chin tilted up. But the cracks were visible. His steps were stiffer, his eyes darting briefly to Nia before flicking away. The smugness that had defined him last night was gone, replaced by a tension that clung to him like a shadow. He took his seat, adjusting his uniform as if it could shield him from what was coming. Nia caught his glance and held it, her expression neutral but piercing. He looked away first. The judge entered and the room fell silent. Judge Margaret Ellison, a woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, settled behind the bench, her sharp eyes scanning the case files through wire-rimmed glasses. "Let's make this quick," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "I've got a full docket." The prosecutor, a wiry man with a meticulous air, rose and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we're here to address the unlawful detention of Lieutenant Commander Nia Carter. Evidence suggests not only a lack of probable cause, but a pattern of misconduct by the arresting officer, Sergeant Scott Reynolds." A murmur rippled through the sparse crowd. Reporters, a few curious locals, and an officer or two from the precinct. Reynolds shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he kept his eyes fixed on the judge. Ellison raised an eyebrow, glancing at him over her glasses. "Sergeant Reynolds, care to explain?" Reynolds leaned forward, his voice steady but strained. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. She questioned my authority and refused to comply." The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. "Uncooperative?" He turned, lifting a document from the table. "Lieutenant Commander Carter's record is impeccable. Naval Academy graduate, decorated officer, multiple commendations for leadership and service. No criminal history, no citations. Are you suggesting that a woman of her caliber posed such a threat over an alleged broken tail light that arrest was necessary?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it, the silence damning. The prosecutor pressed on, his voice rising with precision. "Furthermore, an internal review of your arrest history reveals a troubling pattern, disproportionate stops and arrests of black drivers in this district." The murmurs grew louder, a low hum of disbelief and indignation. Reynolds's face flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. Judge Ellison sighed, setting down her pen. "Sergeant, I'm not liking what I'm hearing. Anything else to add?" Before Reynolds could respond, the prosecutor held up a tablet. "Your Honor, the body cam footage tells a different story." The screen flickered to life, and the room watched in rapt silence. The video showed Nia, calm and composed, asking reasonable questions, while Reynolds grew visibly aggressive, his tone sharp, his actions unwarranted. When the footage ended, the silence was deafening. Ellison leaned forward, her gaze pinning Reynolds like a specimen under glass. "Sergeant, you broke protocol, made an unlawful arrest, and omitted critical details in your report. This isn't just sloppy, it's misconduct." She turned to the prosecutor. "Charges against Lieutenant Commander Carter?" The prosecutor shook his head. "Dismissed, Your Honor, and we recommend a full internal investigation into Sergeant Reynolds' conduct." Ellison nodded, her gavel slamming down with finality. "Charges dismissed. Sergeant, expect internal affairs to be in touch. This court is adjourned." The room erupted in whispers as Nia stood, her posture unchanged. Steady, composed, victorious without gloating. Reynolds sat frozen for a moment, his face a mask of shock and fury, before storming out, the weight of every eye in the room on his back. Nia exchanged a glance with Vaughn, who gave a small nod of approval. As they gathered their things, Nia felt the moment settle over her, not just a personal win, but a crack in the armor of a system that had protected men like Reynolds for too long. She stepped into the hallway, the light brighter now, her path clear. Reynolds had underestimated her, and now he'd pay the price. The courthouse hallway buzzed with the low hum of conversation, reporters scribbling notes and officers whispering among themselves as Nia Carter stepped out. The air felt lighter now, the weight of the cell and Reynolds' arrogance left behind in the courtroom. She walked with the same measured stride she'd carried through years of naval service, her navy blazer catching the morning light. Erica Vaughn matched her pace, her briefcase swinging lightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "They'll be talking about this one for a while," Vaughn said, her voice low but satisfied. Nia nodded, her eyes fixed ahead. "Good. Let them talk." Across town, Scott Reynolds' world was unraveling. He stormed into the precinct's administrative wing, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too conspicuous. The eyes of his colleagues followed him, some curious, others accusing, as he was ushered into Chief Daniel Harper's office. The door clicked shut behind him, muffling the chatter outside. Harper, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for fairness, stood behind his desk, a thick file open in front of him. "What the hell were you thinking, Reynolds?" he demanded, his voice low but cutting. Reynolds squared his shoulders, clinging to the last scraps of his bravado. "I was doing my job, Chief. She was non-compliant." Harper cut him off, tossing the file across the desk. "Your job? You arrested a decorated Navy officer without cause, fabricated charges, and got caught on your own body cam. This isn't just bad judgment. It's a career ender." Reynolds' mouth opened, but no words came. Harper leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Internal Affairs is already on this. You're suspended, effective immediately. And if this review confirms what I'm seeing, you're done. Badge. Gun. Now." Reynolds' hands shook as he unclipped his badge, the metal clattering against the desk. For the first time, he felt small, stripped of the power he'd wielded so carelessly. Meanwhile, Nia sat in a quiet cafe across town, the murmur of the case already spreading through news alerts on her phone. "Officer suspended after unlawful arrest of naval officer." She scrolled through the headlines, her expression unreadable. A message popped up from a friend in the Navy's legal division. "Reynolds is done. Might face charges. You okay?" Nia's lips curved into a faint smile as she typed back, "I'm fine. This was never just about me." She set the phone down, her coffee steaming in the morning light, and let her thoughts settle. The victory wasn't just hers. It was for every person Reynolds had targeted, every driver pulled over for no reason, every life disrupted by his unchecked power. Nia thought of her early days in the Navy, the microaggressions she'd faced, the assumptions about her competence, her place. She'd fought then too, not with fists, but with excellence, proving her worth in a system that often doubted her. This fight was different, though. It was public, raw, and it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The news was spreading, and with it, questions about the precinct, the system, the patterns of bias that had let Reynolds thrive for so long. Her phone buzzed again, a call from her captain. "Carter, you've seen the news?" His voice crackled through the line. "Hard to miss," she replied, her tone steady. "How you holding up?" he asked. Nia leaned back, watching the city move outside the cafe window, a mother pushing a stroller, a group of kids laughing on their way to school. "Like I did what I had to do," she said. The captain paused, then added, "The Department of Defense might want you to speak on this. It's bigger than you now." Nia's brow lifted, a wry smile forming. "I never wanted to be a headline." "You already are," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "The mayor's office called, too. They're talking about a commendation for your professionalism." Nia let out a soft laugh, the irony not lost on her. "I'll think about it," she said, ending the call. She sipped her coffee, her gaze settling on a young boy across the street, his hand in his mother's, his laughter carefree. This was why she'd fought, not just for herself, but for him, for every black child who deserved to grow up without fear of a badge. The road ahead was long, but today she'd struck a blow. Reynolds was down, and the system was watching. For now, that was enough. Nia Carter stepped out of the cafe, the morning sun warming her face as she walked through the bustling streets of Birmingham. The city pulsed with life, horns honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, the rhythm of everyday resilience. Her phone buzzed relentlessly now, notifications piling up, messages from colleagues, a few from reporters requesting interviews, and one from a community organizer inviting her to speak at a local rally against police misconduct. She silenced the device, slipping it into her pocket. Fame wasn't her goal, but impact was, and she knew this moment could ripple far beyond her own story. Back at the precinct, the fallout from Reynolds' suspension was growing. News vans parked outside, their cameras trained on the gray brick building as reporters delivered live updates. "A decorated naval officer's unlawful arrest has sparked calls for reform," one anchor said, her voice carrying over the chatter of onlookers. Inside, officers moved quietly, their usual bravado dampened by the scrutiny. Chief Harper had already called an emergency meeting, promising a review of department policies and mandatory retraining on de-escalation. For many, it felt like too little, too late, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of indifference that had shielded men like Reynolds. Naya's thoughts drifted to the broader fight as she walked. Reynolds wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a system that too often turned a blind eye to bias. She'd seen it in the Navy too. Subtle slights, assumptions about her abilities, the extra hurdles she'd had to clear just to be seen as equal. But she'd also seen change, slow and hard-won, when people spoke up, when they refused to be silenced. This case, her case, was a spark, and she felt the weight of carrying it forward. Not for headlines or commendations, but for the people who didn't have her rank, her resources, or her platform. She paused at a park, watching a group of teenagers play basketball, their laughter echoing across the court. One of them, a lanky kid in a red hoodie, reminded her of her younger brother, who'd grown up navigating the same unspoken rules she had. Keep your hands visible, don't argue, stay calm no matter what. She'd fought for him too, and for every kid like him who deserved to move through the world without fear. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her captain. "You're trending on X. People are calling you a hero." Nia shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. She wasn't a hero. She was just someone who'd refused to back down. The fight wasn't over. Reynolds' suspension was a victory, but the system he'd thrived in still stood. Real change required more than one court case, more than one viral story. It required voices, loud, persistent, unafraid. Nia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She'd speak at that rally, share her story, and support others who'd faced the same abuse. Because unchecked power festers, and justice only comes when people demand it. This story isn't just Nia's, it's a call to action. Unchecked power leads to abuse, and real change only happens when we hold systems accountable. What happened to Nia happens every day to people without her rank or platform, people whose stories don't make the news. That's why we must speak up, demand better, refuse to stay silent. If this story moves you, share it. If it angers you, talk about it. If it opens your eyes, stay engaged. Real change starts with real conversations, and every voice matters. Will systemic racism end by 2030? Maybe not, but each step forward, each story told, each system challenged brings that day closer.